In our readings today, I'm drawn particularly to this second reading from the book of Hebrews, describing the faith of Abraham. Abraham is often referred to as the father of our faith. He's honored for his great acts of trust, of obedience to God. So in that reading it says, "By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called out to a place where he was to receive an inheritance. He went out not knowing where he was to go." So, you see, when Abraham was 75 years old, God called him to leave his home where he had been his whole life and go to a land that he had never seen. Just think about what that would have been like. Right? In fact, many of us might have had ancestors who did precisely that, coming over to the United States. To go to a place that we know nothing about. What kind of faith and trust in God that would require? And so without knowing what would come ahead, Abraham obeyed. Now, we might assume that faith means that someone never has questions, that you never have any doubts as to what God is doing. But that's not really true. It's not accurate, even for Abraham, the greatest model of faith. He himself had doubts. If you continue his story, that after going to the promised land, famine hits, and he doubts. He flees to Egypt, which ends up only bringing trouble. But in faith, Abraham returns back to the land God promised, back on track with the plan that God had laid for him. God then asks Abraham again to trust him, that he will make Abraham the father of many nations, that he'll have many descendants, even though he and his wife Sarah, at that point, had no children. And so for 10 years, they waited for a child until Abraham again had doubts. He takes things into his own hands. He ends up fathering a child with his maidservant. But that was not according to God's plan, and again, that causes great strife within the life of their family. But God is faithful, and he calls Abraham again to renew his trust. This time, he asks him, as a sign of this, go through circumcision, which would be a procedure that would put, at this point, a 99-year-old man at grave risk, in particular to the fulfillment of the promise of having children. But Abraham places his trust in God and obeys. Sarah, though, when she's told that they're finally going to have a son, she doubts and laughs. And when they do have a son, according to God's promise, he is named Isaac, a name which means he laughs. God has put Abraham to these tests throughout, and he's going to give him one final test of Abraham's faith. He tells him, sacrifice your son. So through all the years of trust and struggling and against the doubt that Abraham has gone through, here's the biggest moment. And he puts his faith in God again. God's been faithful to me my whole life, maybe he thought. I don't understand why he's asking me to kill my son Isaac, especially since he's promised that we're going to have many generations. I don't know how it's going to work this way. But as the reading from Hebrews says today, that Abraham reasoned that somehow God must be able to raise up Isaac from the dead. And that's what he would do. Of course, we know in the story that God stops Abraham from sacrificing Isaac, but it's a foreshadowing that God would instead offer his only son, Jesus, as a sacrifice for our salvation. So perhaps you can see in this further story of the life of Abraham, who is our father in faith, and yet he doubted at times. Maybe you can see that in the course of your own life. I can see it in my life. For example, I had everything in college prepared for going to graduate school and study physics, continuing there. But I felt this call from God to consider the priesthood. And so in faith, I left the path that I was on and went to the seminary. I didn't know what was going to happen, just like Abraham didn't. I didn't even really know if I was supposed to be a priest. But I knew that I had to give God a chance. I had doubts. There were days in which I wondered, what am I doing here at the seminary? What am I doing here? How can I be a priest? God, you don't want me. But through prayer and often letters of encouragement that I'd received from people, that helped me sustain my trust in God, to the point of being able to accept his call to me to be a priest. Of course, just like Abraham, God calls us to faith and trust multiple times in the course of our life. And so certainly even now as a priest, there's times when I get to feeling overwhelmed, like I'm doing everything wrong, like, God, why did you really want me? I'm not that great of a priest. But in faith, I trust God that he's called me to be where I am for a reason. And that if he has called me, that he will guide me in what I'm to do. And so I would guess that many of you could give your own stories of these kinds of experiences, of when God has called you to put greater trust in him. Moments when there's the temptation to doubt, and you call out, what's going on, Lord? But that you renew your faith in him. So Abraham, myself, many of you, it's normal for us to go through this kind of journey in our growth of faith. And so it'll apply as well to the journey of faith, the pastoral planning process that I began talking about last weekend. Father Cordy, who is the pastor up in Hartington, he's the convener priest for the group that Osmond and Randolph is going to be joining. And he's recommended, in particular, this example of Abraham to help us reflect upon what we have to do in going through the planning for the future. We're being called out of the comfort of the homeland that we've been used to living in, just like Abraham. The comfort of how we've always done things, to travel out on journey to find something new that we've never seen before. It's a moment in which we're called to great faith. As I spoke about last weekend, we're facing this due to the current realities, the population shift, the decreased attendance in Mass, and fewer priest numbers. A number of these things that we might not really be able to fully control. But we can decide whether that we will step out in faith or not. So, for example, based upon those realities, the Archdiocese has given certain parameters in the planning process that within these parameters, the leaders of our parishes have been gathering together and are striving to apply the particular situations of our group of parishes to develop a plan for the future. And I know that what's on many people's minds is that some of the parameters have specifically to do with a limit on what kind of masses and what places those can be celebrated. Discussions have begun within the various groups of what a future Mass schedule could possibly look like, but nothing, of course, at this point is final. And so fears and doubts are expected when we're faced doing something differently, because we'll want to stay where it's familiar. We want to be what's comfortable, what we know. And I'm sure Abraham at first, he doubted that could anything good come from leaving my home and going off to this place that I don't know anything about? Some place that's foreign? And so for us, many can question, how can anything good come from a situation that's placed perhaps a number of parishes that might not be able to have a Sunday Mass on a weekend? But if Abraham had not stepped out in faith, then he would have missed all of the amazing things that God had in store for him. And that's the same way for us. It can be very difficult to see where is it that we are going. But we too must step out in faith if we are to receive the good things that God desires to bring to us. If we don't, we can see where we might be left. If we look at the statistics of our Mass attendance, a little bit more specifically than I looked at last week, if we don't do anything, the projection would be rather stark. For the 7 parishes that are in the group with Hartington, the attendance 20 years ago was 63%. Today, it is 39%. Following the trend, we can project out the next 10 years. If we decide to change nothing at all and to continue as we are, we in 10 years would reach 29% of attendance. And that would be around only 860 people going to Mass in the entire 7 parish grouping combined. So the question for us is, do we really have to resign ourselves to what we've always done? To resign ourselves to just trying to maintain each of our separate communities, each which have been dwindling through the years, until we get to the point in which we have so few committed members that the same people are doing everything, stretching one another as well as our priests so thin, until we just simply wither away. Do we have to do that? I don't think so. I think we can desire a better homeland. We need an imagination for what is possible, what renewal God can do, what good that He can have in store for us, what amazing things that He can do in bringing us out of where we are, like Abraham, to the new promised land. Why not create a future, for example, where our communities gather and work together, where we create centers of faith, gathering for a common Sunday experience? It might mean some people may have to travel a little further, but we come for a fuller experience where the liturgy is done most beautifully, with an experience truly of the sacredness of God, an encounter with Jesus, where we come not just for an hour so that we can take care of it and get it over with, but those that are coming are committed and are on fire for making it truly the Lord's day. Perhaps creating opportunities for growth for our families and formation in the faith outside of Mass, where we invite our neighbor, where we pick up and bring those that are unable to drive themselves, where we would create something where our priests can actually be part of our communities on Sunday, rather than immediately after Mass being over, we have to go run off and drive to the next service. What if the highly committed members in all of the parishes saw and talked with each other and supported each other in the task of growing in our ability to go forth and evangelize, to invite more, to bring people to encounter Christ, rather than feeling so often isolated in our places that we have to do it all alone? So what I'm describing there isn't what's been determined will happen. No. So much is still in the air, and it greatly rests upon the openness of all of you, of our leaders, of all the people of God. But those are some of my musings to get us to begin to think about what could be possible if we set out like Abraham. Faith trusts, even though we can't see what is in the future. Even though we can't see how God might bring good, faith trusts that He will. Faith means that we take that first step.